This video is sponsored by Taskade, a real-time organization and collaboration platform. Make sure to check the description for a discount on your subscription. Hey everyone, my name is Vishwas, and in this video, let's take a look at the roadmap to learn Angular in 2022. This video is intended to serve as a guideline for anyone who is planning to start learning Angular in the year 2022. Before we begin, let me tell you that you need to be familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before starting Angular. If you haven't already, make sure to check the other two learning path videos. Alright, let's get started. I've broken down the path into three sections. Let's begin with the first section, which is the fundamentals of Angular. This section is for you if you are a complete beginner. Before starting with an Angular application, you'll need to focus on learning TypeScript. Angular is a development platform built on TypeScript. So your first task is to understand what is TypeScript, why is it used, and learn some of the TypeScript fundamentals. You don't have to be an expert by any means, but a working knowledge of TypeScript is very important for writing Angular applications. Once you learn the basics of TypeScript, you can proceed to creating your first Angular project. And for that, you will start with Angular CLI. Angular CLI is a command line interface tool that you can use to create a brand new Angular project with just one command in the terminal. Apart from generating projects, you will also learn that Angular CLI can generate application code and perform a variety of development tasks such as testing, bundling, and deployment. Once you have a new project that you can run, you then get started with some technical concepts in Angular. We'll start with ng modules. Ng modules are the basic building blocks of Angular applications. Some modules are packaged with the library, and then there are some user-defined modules. An Angular app always has at least a root module that enables kickstarting and typically one or more feature modules. For example, if you're building an e-commerce app, you would have one feature module for users, one feature module for products, one for checkout, and so on. So basically, ng modules provide a compilation context for components, which brings us to our next concept. Angular has a component-based architecture. So every UI element you see in the browser is defined by a component. A component is a combination of a class that controls the logic, a template that controls the view, and some metadata that ties together the class and the template. Most of your work in Angular applications are writing components. The next few concepts to learn revolve around the template syntax, which is an integral part of writing any Angular component. A template is simple HTML with some Angular magic. So you'll need to learn the syntax for the code you will write in an HTML template file. Start with interpolation and property data binding, where the data flows from a component class to the component template. Next, you'll learn about event binding. Event binding allows you to listen to certain events such as keystrokes, mouse movements, clicks, and touches. You'll understand how to run some code based on an event. Next is the concept of two-way binding, which gives your application a way to share data between a component class and its template. This is the banana in a box syntax, which is widely used when writing forms in Angular. Next, you should become familiar with pipes, which let you transform and display data. For example, displaying a string as a currency value, formatting date, etc. Finally, you're going to learn about template reference variables, which are often a reference to a DOM element within the template. Now, once you're familiar with the template syntax, you'll then move on to directives. You could say directives are custom HTML elements that can be used in an Angular application. There are three kinds of directives in Angular. The first one is a component, which we already talked about. In Angular, you include each component as a custom HTML tag that gets rendered in the browser. Next, you learn about structural directives. These directives change the DOM layout by adding and removing DOM elements. You have ngIf and ngSwitch to conditionally render elements, and ngFor to render a list of elements. Lastly, you have attribute directives that change the appearance or behavior of an element, component, or another directive. There are a few built-in directives, which takes us to the next concept: component styling. For adding and removing classes, you have the ngClass built-in directive, and for adding styles, you have the ngStyle directive. Both are examples of attribute directives. You then move on to an understanding of component interaction in Angular. Since our entire application is built with components nested at various levels, you must understand how to pass around data from one component to the other. There are several ways by which components can communicate, but for a beginner, you should focus on the input and output decorators. Input is used to pass data from parent to child, and output allows the child to emit an event to its parent, with which the parent can then run some code. The last bit to learn about in the fundamentals section is a component's lifecycle methods. You'll understand the different phases of a component and how to hook into those phases using the lifecycle hooks. It is also in these hooks that you will execute code many of the times. For example, making an API GET request, or running some code based on changes in a component. Understanding the lifecycle methods is crucial for any Angular developer. Alright, now that you have a good path of the fundamental topics, let's move on to the second section, which covers the advanced topics. The first concept to learn about would be services. When you build an application, you will eventually come across values or functions that need to be shared throughout your application. That is when you make use of a service. A service is simply a class with a specific purpose. For example, providing some constant values or fetching a list of products from an API. Services can also depend on other services. So you will learn about dependency injection in Angular and how to provide a service to a component that needs it. Next, you're going to learn about observables. This is one of the concepts that we all tend to struggle to understand when we get started. Observables are the recommended technique for event handling, async programming, and also handling multiple values. You could say observables are an alternative to promises that you might be more aware of. With observables, you need to understand how to create, subscribe, execute, and finally dispose of them. You will also learn about operators that allow complex asynchronous code to be easily composed in a declarative manner. Speaking of asynchronous, let's move on to the next topic, which is the HTTP client. Angular, being a framework, provides a simplified HTTP client API, which is the HTTP client service. With the HTTP client, you can make GET, POST, PUT, DELETE requests, and even have typed responses which help avoid errors. You will also learn how to handle errors from an API and about the HTTP interceptor. For example, if you have to attach a bearer token for every request, adding an interceptor is the way to go about it. The next thing to learn about is forms. Angular provides two different approaches to work with forms. The first approach is what is called template-driven forms. In this approach, you rely on the directives in the template to create and modify your form model. They are suited for simple forms like login and registration. Coming to the technical concepts in a template-driven form, you will first encounter the forms module. This is the module that provides the necessary directives to work with the template-driven approach. The first directive is the ngForm directive, which attaches on the form HTML tag and tracks the overall form value and validation status. Next, you have the ngModel directive, which you specify to every form field to track its value and validation state. Sometimes you might want to group several fields under one label. For example, an address field which encompasses the street name, city name, and PIN code. In such scenarios, you can make use of the ngModel group directive. Once you get a hang of data binding, you then understand how to track the state and validity of your entire form. When you're able to do that, proceed with adding validation and displaying error messages. Finally, you can make use of the ngSubmit output property on a form tag to submit the form you've created. My recommendation is that if you're new to forms in Angular, get started with the template-driven approach. Once you get a decent idea of how forms work, you can then move on to the second approach, which is the reactive forms approach. Unlike the template-driven approach, which abstracts quite a few things to make it simpler, reactive forms provide more direct and explicit access to the forms model. This approach also better scales and is more robust in the sense that you have better reusability and is testable. If you're building an application that is forms heavy with a lot of complex logic, reactive forms should be your choice. And just like the first approach, reactive forms also have a few technical concepts to get familiar with. We'll start with the reactive forms module that provides you with the necessary directives. To create a single field, use the form control directive, and for a group of fields, use the form group directive. We'll then learn about setValue and patchValue methods that let you programmatically modify either the entire form model values or only a portion of the form model values. The next bit you'll come across is the form builder service. When you get started, you'll be creating form controls and form control groups manually, which becomes repetitive when dealing with a lot of forms. The form builder service provides convenient methods for generating those form controls. Once your form is up and running, the next step is to add validation. You can make use of the built-in validator functions or even build your own custom validation rules. You'll then learn about the form array directive, which lets you work with an array of values. This will help you add dynamic form controls to your form. For example, adding multiple phone numbers or multiple addresses if the user wants to. Finally, you'll submit the form with the ngSubmit output property. So that is about forms in Angular. The next topic to learn is routing. Since single-page applications have just the one HTML file, it is important to split your app into features and render only the relevant feature for the user. To achieve that, we need routing implemented in the app. Routing allows you to display specific views of your application depending on the URL path. To add this functionality, you will first need to import the router module in your application. Then you're going to learn how to configure different routes for the app. Next, we'll make use of the router outlet directive that dynamically loads a component based on the URL path. To be able to navigate to the different routes from the UI, you'll need to learn about the router link directive. Once you've understood the basics of routing, you will then learn how to configure wildcard routes, which allow you to add 404 pages, and also learn how to redirect routes. When working with routes, you'll often come across scenarios where the content is dynamic based on what the user has previously selected. In such cases, you'll need to work with route parameters. You'll also learn about optional route parameters while you're on the same topic. As your application grows more complex, you may want to create routes that are relative to a component other than your root component. So you'll end up learning about nested routes, also called child routes. After that, we have relative paths that allow you to define paths that are relative to the current URL segment. And you will also learn about a performance optimization technique, which is lazy loading. By configuring your router to lazy load modules, Angular will only load modules as needed rather than loading all modules when the app launches. Finally, we learn about route guards, which prevent unauthorized users from accessing certain routes. For example, allow users to view pages only if they're logged in. Once you're done with routing, you can finish the advanced section by learning a bit about animations in Angular. Now that you're through with the fundamentals and the advanced topics, you can focus on a few things in the Angular ecosystem. For state management, you can use NGRX. If you want to use a UI component library, you can make use of Angular Material. For server-side rendering, you can take a look at Angular Universal. For unit testing, you can learn Jasmine and Karma. And for end-to-end testing, you can learn Protractor. Last but not the least, you can learn internationalization and accessibility with Angular. When you have a good understanding of the different concepts in Angular, try building an application to cement your knowledge. But this pretty much is my take on the Angular roadmap for 2022. Thank you for watching, and if you found the video helpful, please leave a like and share the video with your friends and colleagues.